Let me interrupt you here because what you believe you understand about Melania Trump is likely incorrect. Not misunderstood, not exaggerated. Wrong. For years, one word has trailed her persistently: criminal. People state this confidently, casually, as if it's an established fact. However, when I searched for evidence, I found nothing. Just a rumor that became so well repeated that millions of people stopped questioning its origin. This should concern you because the moment I realized something was wrong was when I asked the most basic question possible. What crime did she commit? Suddenly, everyone fell silent. I have extensive political experience and understand the difference between accountability and something much more dangerous. This wasn't justice. This wasn't investigation. This was character destruction through repetition. Here's what no one wants to acknowledge. Melania Trump was never convicted of any crime. Yet she was condemned by headlines, by whispers, by implication. I remember reading numerous comments where people claimed she must be hiding something, not because they possessed knowledge, but because she didn't explain herself. That's when I understood. This wasn't about crime, this was about punishing silence. Because in today's society, if a woman doesn't defend herself loudly enough, people conclude she must be guilty. I've observed this strategy used before against women, against outsiders, against anyone the public feels entitled to judge. Say it frequently enough, repeat it confidently, never provide evidence, and eventually people stop asking for proof and start treating rumors like facts. So tonight I'm doing what most people won't. I'm analyzing this story carefully, not to protect Melania Trump, not to attack her, but to reveal something much more troubling: how an accusation can exist without a crime and still destroy a reputation. Because once you see how this narrative was constructed, who benefited from it, and why it never required proof, you'll realize something chilling. If it can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. And that's where this story truly begins. Now, before we proceed further, I want to speak directly to you, because if you're watching this from the United States, UK, or Canada, and you've lived several decades on this earth, you already understand something younger audiences often miss. You understand how reputations previously functioned. You remember a time when an accusation required proof, when words like crime and criminal weren't used casually, when someone was innocent until proven otherwise. That's why this story probably made you uncomfortable even before I spoke. You felt it instinctively because many of you have witnessed this happen in real life to neighbors, to coworkers, to family members. Good people quietly damaged by stories that were never entirely true, but repeated just enough to stick. If that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it. And if you're still listening right now, please tap the like button, not for the algorithm, but because stories like this deserve to be heard by people who still value fairness. Share this with someone who remembers what due process actually means. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. This channel exists for people who refuse to accept headlines without thinking. Now let's discuss why Melania's story gained traction the way it did, because it wasn't one major accusation, it was thousands of small ones. A comment here, a headline there, a question framed as a conclusion. She's foreign, she's quiet, she doesn't explain herself, therefore something must be wrong. That's how human psychology works, especially when repetition replaces evidence. I've observed this pattern before. Years ago, someone close to me was accused of something vague, never charged, never investigated, never proven. But the damage occurred anyway because people didn't ask, is this true? They asked, why haven't they denied it loudly enough? That's the trap. And Melania walked directly into it, not because she committed a crime, but because she refused to perform for the public. She didn't cry on camera. She didn't hold press conferences. She didn't explain her past on demand. And in a world obsessed with outrage, that silence was treated as guilt. But here's the truth, and this matters. Silence is not evidence. Rumor is not fact. And repetition is not proof. Once you understand how those lines were deliberately blurred, you'll start to see this entire story very differently. Because the next part of this story is where the rumors actually began. Not in courts, not in records, but in misunderstood moments that were twisted beyond recognition. Once we examine those moments together, the illusion crumbles. Here's what most people never examine carefully, the part where this entire narrative actually began. Contrary to what you may have heard, these rumors didn't start with an investigation. They didn't start with a courtroom. They didn't start with a whistleblower. They started with confusion and then were fed by assumption. Years before Melania ever became First Lady, she was a model, working internationally, traveling legally, doing exactly what countless models before her had done. But when she entered the public eye, people began pulling old photos out of context, posing questions instead of presenting facts. How did she come here? Was everything done correctly? Why doesn't she explain it? Just like that, a question became a suggestion. A suggestion became suspicion, and suspicion became rumor. I've seen this playbook before. You take something ordinary, add mystery, remove context, and let people's imagination do the rest. Some outlets blurred lines between model visas, work permits, and immigration law, topics most people don't understand deeply, and discuss them just vaguely enough to sound serious without actually stating anything verifiable. No one said, she broke the law. Instead, they said, people are asking questions. That's how the strategy works. I remember a neighbor years ago, a quiet woman, who suddenly found herself surrounded by gossip because someone said, I don't know, but something about her feels off, nothing concrete, nothing factual, but it spread anyway. That's what happened here. Melania's modeling photos, which were public, legal, and widely published, were reframed as suspicious. Her accent became a talking point, her privacy became evasive, and every time she chose not to respond, the story grew larger. Not because of new facts, but because silence makes people uncomfortable. And here's the key truth. At no point did anyone present evidence of a crime. What they presented was implication, and implication is powerful, especially when people already have strong opinions. Once you understand that the rumors were born not from wrongdoing, but from misunderstood moments amplified by repetition, you begin to see how fragile truth becomes when it's filtered through outrage. But the story doesn't stop there, because the next phase, the phase that made these rumors feel real to so many people, wasn't about Melania at all. It was about how silence was interpreted and why the public decided it meant guilt. And that's where things truly went wrong. This is where the story takes a darker turn, because this is the moment language started causing damage. No one ever stood up and said Melania Trump committed a crime. They didn't need to. Instead, they used a far more effective weapon: suggestive words. Scandal, controversy, questions remain, unanswered concerns. Those phrases sound serious. They feel investigative. But notice something important. They don't actually accuse anyone of anything, yet they leave your mind searching for guilt. I want you to really consider this, because once those words were repeated often enough, people stopped asking what exactly happened. They started asking, why does this keep coming up? And that's a dangerous shift. I've watched this tactic used on women more times than I can count, especially women who don't explain themselves on command. A woman speaks up, she's defensive. A woman stays quiet, she's hiding something. There's no winning in that trap. Melania's past, her modeling work, her immigration journey, her personal choices was never hidden. It was public, documented, legal. But when reporters framed her story with words like murky or unusual without ever explaining why, they invited imagination to fill the gaps. And imagination is ruthless. I remember sitting in a newsroom once listening to a conversation that changed how I saw media forever. Someone said, "We don't have proof, but we don't need it. The question alone will do the work." That sentence stayed with me, because that's exactly what happened here. Each article added a layer, each segment added tone, each headline added suspicion. And eventually, the absence of evidence was mistaken for evidence itself. That's how rumors mature into common knowledge, not through facts, but through repetition. And once that happens, even correcting the record feels suspicious to people who already believe the story. That's why Melania's silence became the centerpiece of the narrative. Not what she did, not what she broke, but what she didn't say. And in the next part of this story, we need to discuss that silence, because it wasn't accidental and it wasn't weakness. It was a choice that came with a cost no one talks about. What made this story explode wasn't something Melania Trump did. It was something she refused to do. She didn't rush to microphones. She didn't sit down for tearful interviews. She didn't issue long explanations about her past every time a rumor resurfaced. She stayed silent. And in today's world, silence is treated like a confession. I've watched this pattern repeat itself again and again, especially with women who choose dignity over performance. When a woman explains herself, people say she's scrambling. When she doesn't, they say she's hiding something. There is no safe option in that game. Melania came from a background where privacy was valued, where you didn't owe strangers a detailed account of your life, where explaining yourself to people who already decided what they believe was seen as pointless. But American political culture doesn't work that way. Here, silence invites suspicion. It creates a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled with whatever people want to believe. I remember an older woman I once spoke with, someone who had lived a quiet, honest life. She told me, "I didn't defend myself because I didn't think I had to." And by the time she realized people had made up their minds, it was already too late. That's exactly what happened here. Melania's silence was interpreted as arrogance by some, as guilt by others, and as mystery by those who wanted a story to chase. But inside the Trump family, that silence came at a cost. Donald Trump is not someone who ignores attacks. He fights them loudly, publicly, aggressively. Melania did the opposite. And that difference created tension, not because they didn't support each other, but because they protected themselves in different ways. One fought outward, the other pulled inward, and while the public argued about rumors, the family absorbed the emotional weight quietly, especially Barron, who grew up watching headlines judge his mother without ever knowing her. Silence protected Melania's dignity, but it also allowed others to define her story. And once a story is defined for you, reclaiming it becomes almost impossible. That's why the rumors never faded, and that's why the damage lingered long after the headlines moved on. But the most misunderstood part of this story is what the law actually says and what it never said. Because when you strip away emotion, politics, and speculation, the facts tell a very different story, and that's where we're going next. This is the moment where we separate what people felt from what actually existed. Because once the word criminal entered the conversation, many people assumed there had to be a legal foundation underneath it. But there wasn't. No charges, no investigations, no violations, quietly buried in paperwork, nothing. And that matters. Melania Trump entered the United States legally. She worked legally. She adjusted her status legally. Every step of her immigration process followed pathways that existed long before her name ever appeared in a headline. But here's the problem. Immigration law is complicated, and complicated systems are easy to distort. So instead of explaining it clearly, commentators leaned into confusion. They blurred different visa categories together. They spoke vaguely about questions without answering them. They used technical language most people don't deal with daily, and let suspicion grow in that gap. I've watched this tactic used before. If you don't understand how something works, it's easy for someone to tell you, well, something seems off, and leave it there. That's what happened here. At no point did any authority state Melania broke the law. At no point did any agency accuse her of wrongdoing, yet the rumor persisted, not because of evidence, but because repetition feels like confirmation. I once spoke to an older gentleman who told me, if something's repeated often enough, people assume someone checked it already. That assumption is dangerous because truth doesn't spread the way rumor does. Truth is slower, less exciting, less profitable. Rumor moves fast. It fills silence. It feeds outrage. And Melania's story sat right at that intersection, a public figure, a complicated system, and a public that wasn't given clarity. So when people say there must have been something, what they're really saying is, I heard it enough times that it felt real, but feeling real is not the same as being true. And once you understand that no legal authority ever confirmed wrongdoing, the entire narrative shifts. What looked like scandal starts to look like misunderstanding. What sounded like exposure starts to look like exaggeration. And what was framed as criminal reveals itself as something far more common, a rumor that outlived the facts. But even knowing this, the story didn't end because law wasn't what kept these rumors alive. Emotion was. And the emotional fallout inside the Trump family is the part no one ever talks about. That's where we're going next. While the public argued about rumors, something quieter and far more painful was happening behind closed doors. Because no matter how tough a person looks on the outside, constant suspicion has a way of seeping into the walls of a home. Melania didn't read every headline, she didn't scroll every comment, but she felt the weight anyway. You can feel it when people look at you differently. When conversations stop mid-sentence, when invitations quietly disappear, when your name carries a tone before it carries facts. Inside the Trump family, that pressure showed up in small, human ways. Donald Trump fought publicly, loudly, aggressively, the way he's always handled attacks. Melania withdrew privately, protectively, quietly, the way people do when they're tired of explaining who they are. Those two coping styles don't clash loudly. They drift apart slowly. And then there was Barron, a child growing up under a microscope he never asked for, a boy watching adults argue about his mother using words he didn't fully understand but could absolutely feel. I've spoken to grandparents who know this pain. They've told me when children sense tension, they don't ask questions, they absorb it. Barron absorbed it. Melania became even more guarded, not because she was hiding anything, but because she was protecting him. Every silence was a shield. Every refusal to engage was deliberate, but that protection came at a cost. Friends noticed she spoke less. Family gatherings felt shorter. The warmth she once brought into rooms was replaced by caution. Not anger, not bitterness, caution. And Donald, for all his bluster, felt that distance. Not because Melania blamed him, but because the noise surrounding them made quiet intimacy almost impossible. This wasn't about guilt. This wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about the emotional tax of being constantly questioned without ever being charged. I remember a woman once telling me I felt like I was always on trial, even though no court ever called my name. That's what Melania lived with, and when you live like that long enough, you stop trying to convince people, you focus on surviving. That's why these rumors lingered, not because they were true, but because the people affected by them were too busy protecting their family to fight every whisper. But the most misunderstood part of all this is what happened next. When Melania finally chose distance over defense, because that choice wasn't weakness, it was strength, and it changed everything. When Melania chose distance, many people misunderstood it. They said she was cold, detached, uninterested. But the moment I saw how she stepped back from the noise, I recognized it instantly because I've done the same thing. There comes a point in life, especially after you've been misjudged enough times, when you realize something powerful. You don't owe everyone access to you. You don't owe strangers explanations. You don't owe critics your pain. And you certainly don't owe rumors your energy. Melania didn't retreat because she was guilty. She retreated because she was tired. Tired of defending a story that never had facts behind it. Tired of watching people argue with a version of her that didn't exist. Tired of sacrificing peace to satisfy curiosity that would never be satisfied. I remember a season in my own life when stepping back was the only way I stayed sane. People called it avoidance, but it wasn't. It was self-preservation. That's what Melania chose. She focused on her son, on her private circle, on protecting the parts of her life that hadn't been consumed by speculation. And here's something seniors understand deeply. Distance is not abandonment, it's boundaries. Melania didn't stop caring about her family. She didn't stop supporting her husband in the ways that mattered privately. She simply stopped performing reassurance for a public that had already decided what to believe. And that decision changed the narrative. Not because she spoke, but because she refused to. The irony is painful. The quieter she became, the louder the rumors grew. But the people closest to her saw something very different. They saw a woman choosing stability over chaos, dignity over defense, protection over performance. And once you understand that, the story stops looking suspicious and starts looking familiar. Familiar to anyone who has ever stepped away. Not because they were wrong, but because they were done explaining themselves. That's why the rumors never got a response. Not because Melania couldn't answer them, but because she decided they weren't worth answering. And the final truth of this story, the part most people never confront, is what this entire episode actually reveals about how power, silence, and public judgment work together. By this point in the story, something important should feel clear to you. This was never really about Melania Trump, not in the way people pretended it was. It was about how power works in public life and how silence gets weaponized against people who refuse to play the game. Because when someone is loud, people argue with their words. But when someone is quiet, people argue with their imaginations. Melania became a blank screen onto which others projected whatever story suited them. Fear, suspicion, resentment, even envy. And once that happens, truth becomes optional. I've watched this cycle repeat itself across decades in politics, in business, even in small town communities. A person doesn't need to do anything wrong. They just need to be different, private, unwilling to explain themselves on demand. And then the questions start. Why doesn't she talk? What is she hiding? Why won't she defend herself? But here's the question no one asks. Why are we entitled to her explanation? That question matters, especially for those of us who grew up in a time when privacy still meant something. There was once a belief that a person's life didn't belong to the public just because they were visible. That belief has eroded. And Melania's story shows us the cost of that erosion. Because once privacy is treated as guilt, no one is safe. Not politicians, not spouses, not children. I've spoken with seniors who told me, if this happened when I was younger, I wouldn't recognize the world anymore. And I understand that feeling. This isn't just a story about rumors. It's a story about how quickly society forgets the difference between curiosity and cruelty. Melania didn't lose anything legally. She didn't face consequences in court, but she paid something far more personal. The constant awareness that people felt entitled to judge a life they never actually knew. And that's the part of this story that should give us pause. Because once accusation becomes entertainment and silence becomes suspicion, truth becomes the first casualty. And in the final part of this story, I want to talk about what happens next. What this means for families, for public figures, and for anyone who has ever been quietly misjudged. Because the real ending here isn't about Melania Trump at all. It's about us. When you step back and look at this story as a whole, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Melania Trump was never proven guilty of anything because there was nothing to prove. No court, no charge, no conviction. What existed instead was something far more powerful than evidence, a story people wanted to believe. And that's uncomfortable because it forces us to confront something about ourselves, about our culture, about how easily judgment replaces patience. Melania didn't fight back loudly. She didn't perform innocence. She didn't turn her life into a press conference. She chose something quieter: dignity, distance, protection. And whether you agree with her politics or not, that choice deserves honesty, not distortion. I've lived long enough to know that the most damaging accusations aren't always the ones made in courtrooms. They're the ones made casually, repeated carelessly, and believed without question, especially by people who assume someone else must have checked. This story matters because it reminds us of something seniors understand deeply. Character is not built by headlines, truth is not determined by volume, and silence is not a crime. Families feel the weight of public judgment. Even when the public moves on, children absorb it, marriages absorb it, lives quietly adjust around it. And once that damage is done, there's no correction headline loud enough to fully undo it. So the next time you hear a story wrapped in implication, but missing proof, pause. Ask the question no one else is asking. What do we actually know? Because truth doesn't need exaggeration and justice doesn't fear clarity. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of moments in your own life when silence was mistaken for guilt, then there's another story waiting for you right now. Just left-click the video on your screen and I'll meet you there.